Without further ado, let's get started. I'd like to introduce Shefaza, who is a lecturer at the University of Waterloo in the Department of Environment. Welcome. And of course, I'm Christine. I work for the Waterloo Public Library, and we're both compost enthusiasts. So, yeah, Shefaza and I both live, well, I live in an apartment now, and I think Shefaza mentioned as well in an apartment now. Where compost, the regular street side compost isn't done, isn't collected. So we found other ways to compost our food because it's definitely a way to help save the environment, to reduce greenhouse gases, and also food waste is kind of really a shame. These are Canadian stats. The average Canadian household apparently throws out something like $1,500 worth of food every year. And 47% of that is us, is consumers. I looked at a couple different studies. One of them was from the UN, actually posted consumers at more, but had us wasting slightly less. But these were, the range seems about right compared to the different studies I looked about. So, and this is Canadian data. We waste more food than the US, more food than the UK. So this is something that would be really good if we could stop. Food waste in Canada is broken down into a couple types. 30% of it is vegetables. And then, you got fruit, leftovers, bakery, dairy and eggs, meat, and, other random things. Some food waste is avoidable. So about 63% is food waste that we don't need to throw out, or we wouldn't need to throw out if we maybe planned a little bit more carefully, maybe taken better care of it in the fridge, things like that. And then, there is a small percentage that's unavoidable. So you don't eat the bones, you don't eat the shells, you don't eat the coffee grinds, and so on. As I mentioned, the best way to avoid food waste or unnecessary food waste is to, do a little bit of meal planning and only buy the things for the week that you're going to use. And then, also to store fruits and veggies in sort of optimum conditions. I had a friend once who was throwing out vegetables because they'd wilt in her fridge, but she was putting them in her fridge without covering them, which meant that the moisture got sucked out of them. They became limp and didn't look good. But really, you throw them in a plastic bag or some other kind of a bag with a little bit of water, spritz them, cover them up. They came back in no time. So how you store your stuff can really affect how long it lasts in your fridge. And we did mention that food waste does contribute to greenhouse gases. Food waste that goes into a landfill, as much as a lot of apartment food waste does, unless the apartment complex has opted into this, the food collection program, it produces methane. Food waste goes into a landfill and it produces methane, which is significantly worse than carbon dioxide. So if you can do sort of any kind of composting process at home to sort of help that along, you're going to help prevent greenhouse gases from entering into the atmosphere. And it does also depend on what you compost. So we, food waste, we throw out more vegetables than we do meat, but even just that little bit of meat produces methane gas, which is so much worse than the CO2. So you can see here the 8% of meat we throw out gives us 19% of the carbon emissions, whereas 25% of vegetables gives us 12. But there are, a couple of tips and tricks that you can do to avoid food waste. And Shefaza is going to share one of her favorites with us now.
Awesome. So I'm just going to go back to the previous slide. One of the tricks that I want to show you today is making soup stock from vegetable waste. So I did used to live in an apartment. I currently now live in a house, and that's how I got really into minimizing my food waste when I was living in an apartment. And I lived in a condo for a while too, which is a townhouse that also did not have organic waste recycling. And so I lived in that house with a friend of mine who bought this book called Thug Kitchen. And in that book was a recipe for creating your own homemade soup stock out of vegetable scraps. And the process is very simple. You collect vegetable wastes and you can freeze these in freezer bags or in yogurt conditions. Okay, I meant to say yogurt containers. You put it into a pot and fill the pot with water. You boil it for about an hour. So the way I put it, I just boil it I put the stove at high for about 15 minutes, make sure there's a good boil going, and then I lower it down to 6 for the next 45 minutes. My friend used to make soup stock out of meat bones that were left over, and she would add vinegar to really bring out all those fats. This could work for homemade soup stock as well from vegetable waste. I do put it in just for a little bit of a tang, and it works really well. And once it's all boiled, it'll have a really reddish kind of color. It depends on what you put in your soup stock that will give it the color that it gets. And then you sieve and partition. So I'm going to show you how I've done it in the past using some pictures. So here you see the yogurt containers in which I put my food waste. So I've used broccoli stalks, kale stalks, Napa cabbage, like the ones that seemed wilted or had gone sort of bad, but not super bad just yet. Onion peelings, carrot peelings, spring onion ends. A lot of different kinds of vegetable scraps can go into your stock. And then I just put it into a big pot. And I fill that pot up, as you can see, with water. And then I put it on high to heat. And this is kind of the process that it becomes. So first you have clear water with lots of vegetables that look crisp because they just came from the freezer. And then slowly they wilt and the soup turns into a more brownish, reddish. One time I put a lot of greens in there, so I had a very green soup stock. And once you see that kind of color, it's good. That's your soup stock. So I give it about an hour. Sometimes I'll put a little bit more water and let it go on for an hour and a half. So that's really, it depends on trial and error, whatever works for you. And then once you have that, I use this kind of sieve to take out to filter out the soup stock from the rest of the veggies, and measuring cup. And I use the measuring cup to try and put 2 cups into mason jars. This is because a lot of recipes call for multiples of 2 cups of soup stock. And so it works out for making soups from recipes. And so I just put that into something that's freezable. I generally have lots of pasta jars lying around, so I put them into the pasta jars. And you can kind of have a measurement in your pasta jar for 16 ounces. Sometimes I have a little bit left over at the end, not enough for a jar, so I just kind of distribute it amongst all the other jars. And so I have just a tiny bit more than 2 cups, but really it makes soup so delicious. And the leftover waste, yeah, there's still some waste. And if you do live in an apartment or a condo where there isn't organic waste recycling, this is going to go into the landfill. But you've taken most of the nutrients out of what was unavoidable food waste, which means there's less for microbes to get at, which means that there's going to be less carbon dioxide produced from that, and therefore less greenhouse gases. The trick is to let it sit for a little bit, cool down, because you don't want the methane producing microbes to start growing in there before you put it into your garbage. So let it cool down. Once it's room temperature, then you can put it into your garbage. And this is, I get usually 6 of these from one pot of soup stock, or one pot of lots of frozen veggie waste. And if each of them has 2 cups, that's a lot of soup. I'll give it back to Christine.
Awesome. Yeah, we actually did that soup stock for dinner tonight. It was great. I added some other leftover food and it just like was perfect. So there you go. So I was looking at different methods around the beginning of the year. I was like looking at different methods of composting. And I came across a number of composting methods that are not complete composting, they're pre-composting. But they are designed to be done in apartments and they have various, investments of time and money. So I'll run through some of the options that we had that I looked at, and then I'll tell you sort of which one I picked and how it went. But first, a little bit about pre-composting. Pre-composting, I call it pre-composting. It doesn't turn your food waste completely into soil. It does sort of partially break down your solids so that they can be composted more quickly and easily. It decreases the decomposing potential. So the same way in the soup broth, there were less in the waste that you threw out eventually, there were less nutrients in it that resulted in less greenhouse gases. This is sort of the same idea. You can use it to feed your potted plants with caution. I'll tell you about that later. And actually what we do is we have a friend who has a garden. They have a house, they have a garden. I won't want to be running to their place, like every day to give them my food waste. But with this method, what I can do is I can store it much easier for, like 3 to 4 weeks. And then I'm making once a month, I'm making a trip over, and contributing to their compost pile. So, yeah. So the different methods I looked at, one of the ones I was really curious about is this thing called the food cycler. I love techie stuff, so this is like the techie solution. It runs on low energy. You can run it, multiple times a day, apparently. There's no smell. And what it does is you put your little basket here, full of, food waste in it, and then you can add, little food waste in it. You shut the lid. It has a filter and that cleans out the smell, and it runs, and it basically turns it into like this dry stuff that looks kind of like potpourri, right? Like kind of. And those little chips are, you can put them in your plants to try to get them to decompose. You could store them in a large bin and then dump them out at some point, again, into a friend's compost heap or something. Or even, if you know someone who gets the proper curbside organic recycling, save it, and then one day just put it out next to their stuff, and then it'll be gone. So that was the food cycler. It has a price tag of about $500, which, I mean, you can get them on sale sometimes, so sometimes it's not that bad. That was a higher investment than I really wanted to make. And it also comes with a specialized filter that lasts approximately 4 months. So you're changing that every 4 months to sort of keep the stink down. And yeah, I'm still intrigued. I'm still very intrigued. If anyone gets this and decides to go with it, let me know. Because you can stick it, like you don't have to keep it in your kitchen to run it. You can stick it in your closet or whatever and just run it in the background whenever you need to. So. Bokashi composting is another method of pre-composting. What you do is you put your food scraps in the bin here, and then you would pour about a cup of this Bokashi bran, which is the stuff in the bag there with the big circle label on it. You put about a cup in, and then next time you throw more food scraps, you add another bit of bran, more food scraps, more bran, and you just build it up in layers. Once you have your bin full, you'll have to set it aside to let it continue to compost for about 2 weeks. They generally recommend that you have 2 bins. You buy 2 bins so that you can have one filling up and then the other one sitting. And then when that one's done sitting, you sort of empty it and then sort of just cycle the two around. Yeah, so this is, not very expensive. People claim that it doesn't stink very much. I have heard that the brand can kind of get everywhere. So my choice for composting was this urban composter, which is the same principle as the bokashi, except that you've got a specialized spray. So I have a bin that looks like this. I throw my food scraps and any waste and things in there. I give it 2 or 3 spritzes, and then I close the lid, and next time I add more food, I do the same thing. It does have the same thing where you're supposed to switch out the bins. I found a sort of a different solution so that I don't have to buy 2 bins, and I'll show you that soon. But yeah, this was the one I chose overall. And this is what it was like unboxing it. So it came in a recycled box, this Good Food box. The company that sent it was like, nope, no new box for you. We're going to give you a recycled box, which is great. Yeah, and I got this the large bucket here with a spout at the bottom, and the spray, and then a masher, so you can mash your garbage down. Which, yeah, it works. It works, especially with the eggshells. So I put a little bit of paper towel at the bottom just to kind of try to keep things from clogging up down there. And then I threw in my first sort of deposit. There was an orange that was sitting, you know how you buy oranges and the middle orange is always going bad. So yeah, I cut that up and put it in. I do advise that you cut things small before you put them in the bin. It just decomposes much faster, and you'll notice, when we get to the end pictures, you'll see that you'll see the pieces that I did not cut up small. First reactions, I gave this a spray and sort of went, "Wah! It stinks." So it advertised itself to be smell free. You don't smell anything when you shut the lid. The spray is what smells. But once you sort of spray it and shut the lid and give it a second, you won't smell anything. And then after a couple days, once things start to ferment and you're like, this should be really, really ripe, you'll actually notice that the spray does kind of help keep the smell at a minimum. So it's not, it's not completely odorless, but unless the bin is open for a long time or you're spraying it a lot, then yeah, that's going to be, it'll be okay, right? As long as it's shut, I don't smell it. It's actually right next to our kitchen table while we're eating. We eat next to it. It's not a problem unless I open it up and try to throw something in while we're eating. So I've taken to keeping a jar sort of beside my sink, and I throw all my food waste in there. And then at the end of dinner, when I'm done preparing or whatever, I'll dump it all into the compost at one time. So by March 8th, you can see things are piling up. I've got orange peels in there. I've got, I think, a bit of rice cake my son didn't want, some Kleenex. March 10th, I got my first little bit of what's called bokashi tea. That's the spigot at the bottom of the container. I'll go back quickly maybe to show you. Yeah, this spigot down here under where it says March 2nd, you can kind of see it. That spigot will let you drain off the liquid, and it's basically just the liquids that accumulate while things are decomposing and mashing. So like orange juice is in there, and leftover coffee grind juice and all these other things. And you can give it to your plants. You can give this is like a slight plant food to your plants. I wouldn't recommend giving it to your plants full strength. I tried that at first. My plants all kind of went bleh. And then they picked up and they were fine, and actually better. But I would definitely recommend diluting your bokashi tea. By March 13th, someone had given me flowers, which was lovely, but they had to go, so they went into the bin March 15th. And March 16th, it was a little early. I probably could have held off, but I was excited for my first time with the composter. So I bought a giant Lowe's bucket. That's what the blue thing is. And I dumped everything from the compost bucket into the Lowe's bucket. And I did this in my tub. So, it was easy to clean up. It stank, but it was easy to clean up. And then I just covered it with a little bit of a plastic bag and the lid. And I stuck it in our closet to ferment for another 2 weeks. And we didn't smell it or anything until we opened it up. So that sat for a little under 2 weeks. On March 27th, so day 25 after I unboxed and started everything, this was what we gave to our friend's compost pile. So you can see, the tissues are sort of half decomposed. My son's Play-Doh went in there. That's looking really nasty, but it's fine. You can see I think they're cantaloupe peels that I didn't actually chop up real fine. So those, that's what this looked like the day I added it to my friend's compost heap. And then a week later, you can see that the air's gotten to it and it's ground it down to very little. And if I'd cut things up finer, you could mix this with your soil and it would be gone in no time. So that's, that was my composting journey. Overall, I found it doesn't smell unless it's open. I think I've said that. The whole set of, the container and the spray and the masher cost me about $120. And it'll be, the spray is supposed to last me 6 months. So I'm only got to buy that every 6 months. I have a toddler and he has not, opened it, thrown everything around, warded on his head, nothing like that. So we're doing okay. And I don't, maybe your pet could get in there, but I think it'd be harder for them to do. As we talked about, there is a food product at the end that needs to be thrown out, but it's better than throwing out the raw food. You'll reduce your greenhouse gases. And this, even if it makes it to the landfill, will decompose faster in the landfill and not be sitting around forever and ever and producing methane. If you can bury the end product, that's great. If not, like I said, even if you throw it in the garbage, it's better than sending fresh food to the landfill. And don't give your bokashi tea to the plants full strength. Give them a little bit and dilute it with water and you'll be fine. It's not the end of the world if you dump your bokashi tea down the drain. It's fine. So, and that's it. Now, Shefaza is going to talk about her own composting methods, which does better than mine. Take it away.
Thank you, Christine. I don't know if it does better than yours. So many residents don't have green bin service, which we've already talked about, like apartments. Even residents who do have green bin service may not be taking full advantage of it for various reasons. So this is a quick chat opportunity. Can you think of any reasons why people may not be using their green bin services?
Oh, I don't know if they don't have a bin. Maybe they don't know they have it, or even, if it's not easy to get down to the curb and deposit it. Like we have a truck that goes by on our street, but I don't trust a thing to be sitting out there all day and not get ruined.
Yeah, and Connie's saying adding cat litter means it's easy to hit the weight target pretty quickly. So not having a bin or not knowing that there's a bin for the actual curb pickup, if it's not as convenient, then they may not do it. Similar to the bokashi, if like the cleaning of green bins can be a little bit of smelly. So these are all different reasons why people may not be using green bin service, even though they really should be. So there's a lot of organic food waste, and we've already talked about unavoidable versus avoidable food waste. With unavoidable food waste, with the vegetable peels and vegetable waste, we've talked about soup stock. And there's some other things that you could do with orange peels or fruit peels, but there's really not a lot to be done with like cucumbers, for example, or tomato waste, or tomatoes could go into soup stock. There are other examples of things. Or things that have gone super moldy and you don't want to put it in your soup stock. So that would lead us into the avoidable food territory, where the reality is that some things do go bad in our fridge, and no matter how much we try to reduce our food waste, sometimes you just get that orange in the middle that you can't, or strawberries and blueberries that go bad really fast for some reason. So you can do vermicomposting in your home, which is pretty low cost, pretty low labor as well, and feeding worms. It has been shown that it can decrease your waste footprint and increase the awareness of what you're eating, what's in your fridge, and what your waste habits are. So looking at vermicomposting, the word vermicomposting means worms. Vermi means worm, and compost, compost just means compost. So worms are also known as engineers of the soil. They can change the soil ecosystem, and there are different kinds of earthworms. Some worms feed as they go, and others stay in one spot and drag down food to them. Cool fact, there aren't any, all the worms that you see outside in Canada are non-native. There are maybe 2 instances of native worms that were found somewhere in the literature, pretty vaguely, but all the worms that you see now have been brought from outside and have naturalized with the ecosystem. So the worms that you see outside, usually they're like this long. They're the ones who stay in one spot and they drag food down to them. So they'll come up, get leaf litter, and come back down to their spot and eat their leaf. Whereas red wrigglers are surface dwellers and they eat as they go. And they are not usually found in Canada. Usually you can get the European variety or the African variety, but they are non-native and they would be invasive given that we already have a non-native population of worms. But it does make them very good for composting, and you want to keep them indoors. So red wrigglers can eat 1/2 of their body weight per day once they're accustomed to their home and the diet that you feed them. They do need grit in their gizzards to help digest, which means that they need to be in the soil, basically. Grit is soil or dirt in their gizzard, which is kind of like their throat, to help them digest anything that they eat. And they actually like to eat the tiny bacteria and mold growing on surfaces of food sources. Nothing is too disgusting for moldy for the worms. With feeding worms, you do want to chop things up really, really small so that the mold and bacteria can grow on all the different surface areas of the food. And by eating the bacteria, they're also eating or making sure that the food is being decomposed. So there are different kinds of composts available on the market, like composters available on the market. But I first, when I got into vermicomposting, created my own worm bin. And I have done a few workshops on this already with the Waterloo Public Library, but also with the university. And I really like the Home Depot gallons for making your own worm bin. So when you're making your own worm bin, you can get one of those 2-gallon or 5-gallon buckets from Home Depot. This is a 2-gallon one. And you can make holes on the bottom for drainage. If you're feeling really handy and you don't want to put holes on the bottom, you could create a spigot on towards the bottom of the bucket, kind of like the urban food cycler or the bokashi. But I just put some holes for any water to drain if the worm bin gets too moist. So in order to get a worm bin started, once you've made those holes, you want to then prepare the bedding. And this is a carbon source. Usually you want to use something like cardboard or egg cartons. I didn't have any on hand, so I just used newspapers, which is totally fine as well, as long as it's not the glossy kind. It has to be the kind that you can rip up really easily and that can soak in water really easily, because the glossy kind is going to be harmful to your worms. So you make that wet, wring out the moisture and put like a little bit of newspaper in the bottom of the container to cover the surface of the bottom of the container. And then once that's ready, you want to get the worms. The question is, where do you get worms from? So there are different suppliers of worms around Ontario. You can actually find worm breeders on Kijiji. There is one person that I go to reliably for worms, and that's Kathy, although she had run out because of the lockdowns and had referred me to Kijiji. There's also an older gentleman in Cambridge whom I met through an Eco Day event at the Preston Cambridge Idea Exchange, who also donated some worms to me. So that's kind of where I've sourced my worms from. And so once you have your bin, you just put in a handful of worms and some soil, and your worm bin is ready. And then not the same day, but the day after, because you want the worms to get accustomed to their home and you've just taken them out of one container and put them into a different container. So the next day, you can dig a hole in your worm bin and add your food waste, which is chopped up. What my finger is pointing to there is some banana waste. It's very, very ripe banana, so it's basically the same color as the soil. And then cover it with soil. And if you don't have enough soil, you can also cover with newspaper and napkin, anything that is soakable. And then you leave it for 4 to 5 days before adding more, and get your worms accustomed to the diet that you want to feed them with your food waste. And you'll know what you're throwing out more of as you continue to try to store things for feeding the worms. And then when you feed them the next time, you want to put it into a different area of the bin so that the worms migrate to the next feeding area, and then again to the next feeding area, and again to the next feeding area. And that will ensure that they're migrating from old food to new food, and creating compost evenly and uniformly. So this is the person I was talking to you about, Kathy's composters. So you can visit Kathy online at kathyscomposter.com. And Kathy kind of branches out a lot too. So she's got some vermi humor and has started laughter therapy during the lockdown. So Kathy is a great resource to get to know more about red wrigglers before you venture into vermi composting. And you can also buy her vermi composting composter, which is, she calls them like chalets or like really fancy homes for worms. If you're not sure you want to invest in that just yet, I definitely recommend getting the few supplies from Home Depot like I did and creating your own worm bin. That's all from me, and we would love to hear from you. I think there's some things in the chat. Christine?
Yeah.